Alright class, so in this video I'm going to go over painting my sand and then adding some detail onto the starfish. So in my last video I could not do that because the paint was still wet. It doesn't take a terribly long time for the paint to dry. I would wait, about 10 minutes or so between each step that you work on. But I would just feel the area to make sure that it's dry before you start working and moving forward. So now I'm going to start working on the sand, and I can work on the sand because the starfish is dry and the water's dry. So when I go to paint directly up against the water and the starfish, it won't bleed together like you're seeing here. It's going to still hold that straight edge because the paint is dry. I'm going to show you how to use the salt, and I'm going to do like a little bit of the water droplet and the sand. I might add some like textures to the sand and maybe even the starfish. I can't add any textures to the sand until it dries. So this whole watercolor, I'm going over 2 parts, but it might be a 3, 4, 5 part process depending on allowing it to dry, going back in, allowing it to dry, going back in, and that's kind of how watercolor works. All right, so right now I'm just gonna quickly make my sand color. I'm actually gonna use my yellow ochre, which is the goldish brown, and I don't know. It's always good to kind of test the color out on a separate sheet of paper. Kind of want to warm it up, so I'm adding a little bit of my warm red. Let's see what color this is. I feel like that looks okay. But remember, and I'm adding a lot of water too because I want it to be really, really light. Right, I want to make it to a lighter value. Okay, so make sure you have enough watercolor to work with in the area that you're working. Okay, so I think that's a nice color. It's very light, but notice when I put it right up against the starfish, it's not bleeding, okay, into one another because the starfish is dry now. So now I can paint right up against it. Okay, so remember, kind of work fast if possible. Now, you don't have to paint the whole thing. I think my examples I showed you, some of them had white space around the background, and the person was maybe just focusing in on the object itself, which is totally fine. I've just planned on painting my entire picture, and that's just kind of what I planned on doing. But I would like to see at least 50% of the page, if not a little bit more, painted, okay? So just kind of keep that in mind. If you're keeping some of the white space, that's totally fine, but just make sure you're using up at least 50 to 75% of the paper that I gave you, okay? So I just painted the background, okay? So now it's still like a little bit wet. I'm going to, I might just add a little bit more paint up here, okay. And I'm gonna add a little bit of paint splashes to it, all right, like I did in the water. And you may not see the texture that's being created right now in the sand because the color I used is so light. And just be mindful that I'm splattering this whole area and some of the water is getting onto my starfish. That will also create a texture on top of that. So I'm just gonna make sure that I go back in and dry off whatever I splattered onto the starfish because I don't want that to be a texture that's being created on that starfish. Now I did say, I'm being so specific about things like the blue tape, but I did say like the Himalayan salt or like really thick salt works a lot better. I just have like really refined salt, so I don't know how well this is gonna work. It may not work as well, but I'm gonna start just applying salt to the sand area of my picture. And what that should do is kind of absorb some of the color and create like little spots. But the paint, wherever you put it, the paint has to be wet. So like in here, it feels like a little dry. So I'm just gonna put a little bit more color in this area and then go back in and add my salt so that it picks up some of that paint. Yeah, in fact, it's not even gonna pick up that much here because it already started to get a little bit dry. Okay. All right, so you can see it kind of working in this area because my color is also a little bit darker. More so in like this area here, you can see it kind of picking up that paint. Right. So at this point, I'm not going to touch anything on the sand. I'm going to let that dry. Once the paint is dry, I can then wipe the salt off the picture. The salt does not stay on the picture. You will wipe it off. But then it creates like a cool texture underneath. And now I'm going to go in and start adding like some cool textures to my starfish. All right, so I'm going to add maybe like maybe a shadow. All right, so if I'm creating a shadow, remember with the colored pencil, if my color is like a warm red, the complementary color to red is green, right? So I might add a little bit of green into my red, right? So if you look here, I'm adding green into this to create a nice shadow color for my starfish. All right, so I'm gonna pretend like maybe the light's coming from this direction. So maybe I'm gonna add a little bit of a darker value around here. Now I got a little bit of salt on here. That's okay. If you're gonna use the salt, try to be cleaner than me. Okay. But you can see it's not bleeding anymore because the paint is dry underneath. So it's a process, you know? All right, now, I want to go in eventually with a thin paintbrush and paint in some of these lines. However, I don't know if I can really do that right now because I just painted a little bit on top of the starfish again, and it's pretty wet, right? So I might need to let it dry a little bit more before I go back in and do that. But I could start adding some in, like little subtle lines. But not too much because it's still really wet here. This is dry here, so. All right, so I'm at a point where my starfish, it's like pretty wet, and so is the sand. And I feel like I'm kind of done with the water. I'm not sure what else I want to do with it yet. So I'm gonna stop here, and once it dries, I'll create another video for you that I'll show, one more stage so you can see how I go back and forth and work with this. All right.